We're gonna read from both John 6 and Matthew 14 today. John records this fifth miracle. We're actually not going to read from John 6. I'm sorry. This is recorded in both John 6 and Matthew 14. John does record this fifth miracle, but Matthew includes a whole lot more detail. And so we will actually use Matthew 14 as our text for this morning, if you'd like to turn there. We are continuing our Signs and Wonders series. In John chapter 20, verse 31, John tells us that he recorded these miracles so that we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. These miracles were for the purpose of revealing Jesus as the Messiah. My hope is that as we study them, we also get a clearer picture of Jesus. You'll notice we do not have a PowerPoint today. I was trying to work ahead. I knew I was going to be gone much of this last week at Ministerial. And all of a sudden, all of my schedule for the week changed with a loud pop in my ankle. And so that all changed, and then we got back last evening. I just did not have time to get it finished. And so we do have a handout. And did we run out of handouts? We do have... It's on the copy. If you made one copy, you can get one if you really want one. But there's a thank you to Andrew and actually I think Lori helped out chasing down some paper as well. In fact, you don't even have to copy. You just pull it off of the top. That makes sense. Yeah, thank you for that. You can look at John chapter 6, verses 16 to 21. You can see that this miracle takes place directly after the last miracle of Jesus feeding the multitude that we talked about last Sunday. You remember from last week, the crowd and even the disciples, they were worked up into a frenzy, right? They were wanting to take Jesus by force to crown him as king. Jesus separated the disciples from the crowd. He sent them to the boat on the lake. Look at Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 32 to read about what happens next. Verse 22, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I want to share a few truths with you this morning from the account of this miracle about when our storm meets God's supremacy. How many of you have ever been in a period of life that you felt could be easily characterized as a storm? Anybody here like that today? Yeah, I'm seeing some hands. Anybody feel like you're in the middle of one right now? In the middle of a storm? Yeah, I see that. How many of you recognize the reality that seas might be smooth now, but storms are a fact of life, and whether you're in one now or not, eventually you'll be in one too. Anybody recognize that? Isn't that just so encouraging from your pastor this morning? If you are in any of those categories this morning, and I'm pretty sure I saw at least everybody raise their hand at some point. If you're in any of those categories this morning, this message is for you. If you're in the midst of a storm right now, I want you to understand that God is in complete control. He has total supremacy over the storm in your life. And so when you find yourself in the middle of a storm, here's what you need to do. Number one, remember who you're with. Remember who you're with. This passage tells us that they left Jesus on land. They headed way out. When the wind and waves started beating against them, for all they knew, Jesus was still way back there where they had left him. And they were facing this storm all alone, all by themselves. One commentator points out that the occasional separations of the disciples from Jesus were undoubtedly in order to teach them to maintain discipline as his followers, even when he wasn't around. He was trying to teach them that even when he was no longer visible to them, he would still be spiritually present and able to comfort them. It was a lesson that they certainly needed to learn, and we do too. Have you ever felt so pummeled, so battered by figurative wind and waves that you found yourself in the same boat as the disciples? You felt like you were all alone, that you were in that storm, in that boat by yourself? We humans, we have a hard time wrapping our minds around eternal realities sometimes, don't we? Jesus' disciples, they had a track record for not realizing or not understanding these things, didn't they? And I think that's why when he was ascending into heaven, he gave them and us that one final reminder. He said, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. God is always with us. There's a phrase that I've seen around, maybe you've heard it as well. I think it came from a certain political pundit. Facts don't care about your feelings. Have you heard that before? Heard that phrase? That phrase is not always said in the most kind-spirited way. But if we're being honest, it is true, right? All of us, we've experienced times when facts and feelings just don't mix, right? There have been times when we've felt alone, abandoned. We felt like it's all up to us. It's just not true. God promised never to leave us or forsake us. There is nowhere that you can go that will remove you from the presence of God. In Psalm 139, David says, "Oh Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you, David says. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." There is literally nowhere that you can go to remove yourself from the presence of God. There is no storm so great that God is not still right there with you in the midst of it. He is everywhere. That sure is a comforting thought, isn't it? But as crazy as it seems, there are many Christians who are not quite as interested in the presence of God as it might seem at first glance. You will see that right after this miracle, Jesus and his disciples, they land. And the crowd is already there. They're waiting for him. And he has this conversation, this back and forth with them, because it turns out that they're just there because they want him to feed them again. They're not really interested in him. They want bread, but not the bread of life. And I think we often fall into the trap of wanting things from God more than we want God himself. Oswald Chambers said, "It is not God's promises we need. It is God himself." We want health, comfort, knowledge, assurance in uncertain times. We want answers. And there may be times when God wants to give us these things, but we can't have them apart from Him anyway, right? And when we focus on the things instead of on Him, we are obviously focusing in the wrong place. It's not the presence or the absence of particular circumstances that bring us peace or joy. It is the presence of God, regardless of our circumstances, that brings us peace and joy. In Psalm 16:11, David says, "In your presence is fullness of joy." That's why it's important for us to remember that He is present. Remember who you're with. You may not feel like it, but it's a sure reality based firmly on the truth of God's word, straight from the mouth of God Himself. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. The disciples thought they were alone. They were wrong. Jesus was there for them, just like He's here for you. Look back at the passage for another truth. You also need to recognize your deliverer. Remember who you're with and recognize your deliverer. Look at verse 26. They saw Jesus coming. What'd they say? It's a ghost. These were Jesus' closest companions. They had traveled with Him, ministered with Him, watched Him perform miracles. They were there. They were eyewitnesses to these other 4 miracles that we've just covered in this series. If anybody should have recognized that it was Jesus, it should have been them. But they didn't. They forgot what the one that they were supposed to be following looked like. I'm afraid that some of today's Jesus followers have the same faulty focus. We've forgotten. We're not seeing ghosts, but when the winds and waves are high, it can be easy for our vision to get clouded, and we start looking in the wrong places for deliverance. I don't think I could begin to tell you all the times that I've heard something like, doing XYZ is the only hope for our future. Doing this thing, that's the only hope we have. It seems that we are constantly told that our only hope is to do a certain thing, embrace a certain ideology, follow a particular leader. Don't get me wrong here, we do have choices to make and in life, and the choices that we make do affect our future. But if you find yourself wringing your hands in fear and despair over what might happen if the wrong choices are made either by you or by the people around you, your focus is in the wrong place. If you find yourself placing your hope in an imperfect human leader or imperfect human solutions, you have lost focus on who it is that you're really following. You're looking for deliverance in the wrong place. It is just so easy for us to fall into the trap of forgetting who it is that we really follow. In my few years of pastoral ministry, I have found the unfortunate reality that some of the most painful hurts that people have suffered have come from the last place that they ever should have come from the church. The place where we're supposed to edify one another, we're supposed to love one another and encourage one another, has been the source of more sad and painful stories than we could ever have the time to tell this morning. There have been so many Christians who have been battered by the winds and waves of unkind words, bad leadership, false accusations, judgmental spirits, gossiping and backbiting, and all of those things can make your vision really blurry. And you can begin to lose sight of who it is that you're really following. We neglect to take those things to God in fervent prayer. We lack clear direction. And usually when that happens, it manifests itself in foolish decisions. We decide to uproot and we look for a better place to worship without really genuinely, fervently praying about it first. Or we make extreme changes in our lifestyle. We don't stop to consider if the choices that we're making are things that really glorify God. Or we decide just to leave the church altogether. without stopping to consider the eternal implications for ourselves and for our families, because we're sick and tired of these people, or we're hurt by these people, and we forget that it's not people that we're following. We've lost sight of who it is that we're really following. We must not allow the waves and wind of difficult times to cloud our visions and cause us to forget who it is that truly brings deliverance. People will fail you. Circumstances will disappoint you, but Jesus never will. That's why it's important to understand this next truth. Number 3, remain focused on Jesus. I love this part of the story. I was talking to Brother Ron before the service. He said, we are going to talk about Peter walking on the water too, right? He saw the title, just said Jesus. Said Jesus is the main character, but Peter's in there too. Peter exercised great faith. He said, Lord, okay, if it's you, then let me come to you on the water. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, Paul says this. He says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. I love the use of the word walk there. It implies forward momentum. It implies action. You know, the other disciples, they just sat there in the boat in relative safety of the boat. I mean, who in their right mind would willfully put themselves outside of the boat, out there in the middle of the wind and the waves crashing all around you? Who would do that? Somebody with their focus on Jesus would. The reality is that pretty much the entirety of life, it's comprised of winds and waves of various forms. They take on all kinds of forms in our lives. There are constant outside forces that serve to cloud our vision. That's why we must walk by faith. We can't see clearly, but faith isn't just a stab in the dark. It is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And faith is active. It doesn't just sit in the boat and say, okay, that's Jesus. I'm just going to sit here and wait until he comes and gets me. Active, successful faith involves keeping your focus on Jesus, but also it involves jumping out of the boat and trusting him to help you navigate through the wind and the waves of trials and tribulation. There's work to be done. There's a God-glorifying life to be lived. It's important to note something about this situation. Do you remember last week when Jesus tested Philip and it said he himself knew what he would do? You remember that? I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Jesus sent his disciples to the boat in the lake with this storm coming, already knowing full well what he was going to do. I think that in this situation, Jesus purposely sent his disciples into that storm. You'll also note that at first, Jesus didn't calm the storm. He showed his power in the midst of it, while it was still raging all around them. Not always, but sometimes you are in a storm because Jesus sent you there. I want to be careful here. You need to understand it's not always, but sometimes you are in a storm because Jesus sent you there. And often the winds and the waves of that storm, they can serve to cloud our eternal vision. We get our eyes off of Jesus. We get focused on our circumstances, wishing they were different, wishing certain aspects of them would change. We say things like, man, if this one thing, even just this one thing wasn't like this, then I'd be okay. Then I'd be able to do X, Y, Z. Without ever thinking about the fact that God might have sent that thing to you to help conform you to his image. I often need reminded to keep my eyes on Jesus where they belong in difficult situations. But I have a statement that's sort of been a theme for me in recent years. I'm not sure where I first heard it, but I love it. You've probably heard me say it a time or two already. Grow through what you go through. Grow through what you go through. Don't ever let a trial go to waste in your life. It may or may not be that God brought you to that storm on purpose. But either way, he will use it for your good and for his glory if you will allow him. If you will walk by faith and keep your eyes on him, remain focused on Jesus. Let's look one more time at this passage for our final truth this morning. When you find yourself in a storm, remember who you're with, recognize your deliverer, remain focused on Jesus, and lastly, rejoice in the God of your salvation. Look at verses 22 and 23. They got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The disciples went through the storm. Jesus showed his power over the storm, even as it continued to rage in their lives. The point finally comes that it's all over. The water calms down, the wind stops, and the praise rises. Truly, you are the Son of God. Jesus delivered the disciples, and they rejoiced in who he is. We say it often, the entire aim of our lives, even down to the simplest of tasks, like eating and drinking, are to be done in an effort to bring glory to God. But I think that the greatest opportunities, listen to this, I think that the greatest opportunities that arise in our lives to glorify God are when the storms come. We never know exactly how God will choose to receive the glory from our storms, but it's not our job to know the specifics. It's our job to rejoice in him, to bring him glory, whatever that looks like. One of my favorite verses, one that we quote often as Christians, one that I think makes its way into almost every prayer that I pray, is Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for the good of those that love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. That means that the storms of your life, as frustrating or uncertain or painful as they may be, will work out for your good if you are a follower of Jesus. And I know that I talk about this often, but what will the good be? Will it be the healing of your sickness? Will it be income to meet that financial need? Will it be a new job? Will it be a new relationship? Will it be the ceasing, the calming of the storm? Actually, the next verse, verse 29, tells us what the good will be and what God's purpose is for our lives. For those whom he foreknew, it says, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. When the things in your life work out for your good, it means that they helped to conform you to the image of Jesus Christ. When you're in a storm, when you're in a difficult situation, and you say, God, I know you promised that all things will work out for my good, but I just can't see how this one's going to work out. Just refocus and say, God, I don't know how the specifics of this situation are going to work out. I don't know. But I do know that my ultimate good is to be made more like Jesus. Would you make me more like Jesus? For the disciples, they struggled with doubt and uncertainty while the storm was raging. It wasn't until after everything calmed down that they said, wow, you really are God's Son. The reality is, if in that moment they fully understood the truths that we're talking about this morning, they all could have jumped out of the boat and walked across the water with their eyes on Jesus, glorifying God right there in the middle of all the wind and the waves. They didn't, but we're here reading about the story and we're learning from their mistakes today. Are you in the middle of a storm? Some of you have already said that you are. Maybe you can see one looming on the horizon. Is your life fraught with difficulty and uncertainty? Remember who you're with. It might feel like you're alone, but Jesus will never leave you or forsake you. There's nowhere that you can go that will remove you from the presence of God. And in his presence is fullness of joy, David says. Recognize your deliverer. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He graciously uses men to fulfill his purposes, but it isn't his intention for us to become so focused on earthly solutions that we lose sight of him. People will fail you. Circumstances will disappoint you, but Jesus never will. So keep your eyes on him. Walk by faith. Grow through what you go through. Rejoice in the God of your salvation. Strive to bring him glory, not just when the storm is over, but now, even in the midst of your pain, of your difficulty. Understand that your greatest good is to be conformed to his image. Regardless of what happens around you, keep an eternal perspective, and godly focus. When our storm meets God's supremacy, we know true peace, and God receives the glory. Would you stand with me this morning?